Hello everyone, welcome to Emsi webinars. We are very excited today to be joined by Emsi's Executive VP Global Operations, Andy Durman, and the VP of Innovations, Duncan Brown, basically otherwise known as the Dynamic Data Duo. If you have any questions during the course of the webinar, please put them in the questions box in your go-to webinar control panel. And we will endeavour to get to those at the end of the presentation. We will be sending out the recording and the slides from today in a follow-up email, so keep your eyes open for that. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to you, Andy. Hi, Andy.
Hi, Debbie. Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. Thanks once again for joining us today. And I don't think it's too late to wish everyone a Happy New Year, is it? Well, too late. I just did it. So New Year, everyone. And hey, Duncan, welcome. And thank you for joining me once again on today's webinar.
It's all right. Happy to be here.
Right. Mostly because I made you. So, so anyway, thanks everyone for joining us. And today we are kicking off the new year with a look at just what's happening out there really in the labour market, and with particular as we led up to Christmas, we're talking a lot about some of the new challenges facing the labour market, namely that the labour market was really tightening up and demand was going crazy. So today is a chance for us to reflect on that and see if we're still in that position, and want to take you through some interesting research that we are undertaking and introduce you to that as we go through today's webinar. So before we get into all of that, just wanted to welcome long-time viewers, watchers to the webinar series. Welcome back, and if anyone's brand new to this series, welcome. You're very welcome, and hopefully you find this content very interesting for you. For those of you that need further indoctrination or are new to this, a quick intro to Emsi Burning Glass, and you'll see this slide has changed slightly in the sense that we have an evolving mission as we work through our company merger, the merging of Emsi and Burning Glass, and really reinforce our why and our reason for being. And so we're very much here to we're on a mission to really help organizations to serve individuals, communities and institutions with great insights about what's happening in the labor market. So our audience can use that insight to drive economic prosperity and mobility. And our vision is evolving slightly and really honing to reflect how the labor market is changing. And we very much are aspiring to be the global authority on the labor market, and with a particular focus on thinking about this the future of work, which some may argue is the present of work, in all honesty, where there is ever more focus on skills and capabilities as the currency of labor demand and supply. And so we are all about building insights and data that illuminate all of that and help us understand what's going on in the transition, so that we can be prepared as communities to meet the opportunities, to face those challenges and turn them into opportunities. So this webinar series that we run often is about trying to illuminate interesting facets of the labour market and what's happening here in the UK. And we're doing this now as a business right throughout the world. So it's a very exciting mission to be on as a group. So you are very welcome, and thanks for joining us, and thanks for those of you who are customers that are busy serving your communities, and I'm hopeful that we are very helpful to your work. So before we dive into today's topic, Duncan, I'd like to invite you to work us through the latest kind of headline stats that we've been tracking now for, I was going to say some months, but we're probably into years now, aren't we, of the wonders of the beverage curve. And
absolutely. This dead horse has been flogged for quite some time. Another couple of months of labour market data. These are the kind of the headline official measures. That the downside is that they do take a few months to come through. So the unemployment data go to sort of September here, I think, well, no, maybe later, maybe November now actually, So we're at the end of furlough. And generally, the position is continuing as it was before. It should be said that in the latest data, there was a blip up of inactivity, which is quite interesting. But in terms of those that are participating in the labour market, unemployment rate continues to fall, and vacancies continue to be in territory that is kind of unknown in memory. It's now, employers report in surveys over 1.2 million live vacancies as of November. Redundancies at a low level, about 70,000, lower than across this whole time period. So before the financial crisis or in the sort of the mid 2010s, never been so low. And you can see the vacancy rate there. So vacancies as a proportion of the number of people either in work or looking for work, sort of around the kind of 3.5% mark, which is just unheard of. Really, it's a level of demand that we're just not used to. And then the Beveridge curve on the right there, which looks at this relationship between the unemployment and vacancy rate, because intuitively we know that a sort of a loose labour market has low vacancies and a high unemployment. And so you can see the sort of the move in green during the financial crisis when it went down toward the bottom right, and then the slow recovery from 2010 to 2016 in the sort of the dark blue. And then this purple line is this trajectory starting from what we thought of as a very tight labour market back at the start of 2020, where we had unemployment in the sort of the 3 and a bit % range, and vacancies at sort of around 2.5% of the labour force. And first of all, vacancies collapsed to levels that we'd not seen before. Then unemployment started to creep up, and then since sort of early in 2021, we've just seen this rocketing skyward of the purple line, as we see sort of gradually declining unemployment being dragged back because vacancies are just absolutely in unprecedented territory. And I guess the question that this, as unemployment gets back down to the tight levels that we saw before the pandemic, which are sort of unemployment levels that were unknown for sort of for my lifetime. And as Andy will confirm, I'm not a young man. Is how sustainable is that pattern of a labour market? There is a point at which employers are going to have to start rethinking their recruitment plans, because at the moment, just the sheer level of demand in terms of the number of open positions compared to the number of available workers as measured, and it's an imperfect measure through the unemployment rate, suggests that we're going to be seeing during 2022, in all likelihood, a sort of a falling back of employer demand. Not in any bad way in terms of the wider economy, although there could be reasons why that could happen too, if we sort of think about the energy situation and things like that. But even that aside, it just seems likely that the level of labour market demand that we sort of saw toward the end of 2021 just isn't tenable in the long term, really.
Interesting, thank you, Duncan, and useful context as a reminder, as you say, the trends haven't dramatically changed over the last few months of us reporting this, but it just keeps going, doesn't it? The purple up and the dark line on the left hand curve chart, keeps falling down. Be fascinating to see if they ever cross, and I don't know whether that's ever happened in history or not. Maybe very excited about.
Not in the UK, certainly. It's sort of a very strange situation. We released some research just before Christmas, and it had some data in there, which the ONS only releases quarterly, so it'll be interesting when they release the next quarter, which shows that the sort of the turnover, especially among sort of lower skilled workers, is at quite high level. And so that's an interesting side of it, because of course unemployment is only one measure of labour market slack. There are people in work who might be looking for different jobs or the same job but better paid. So it's an interesting one, because of course most people that take vacancies aren't actually currently unemployed. Most people who take on a new job are already in work.
Yes, no, fascinating one to keep a close eye on for sure. Thank you.
So yeah, and another thing that we have been doing through the pandemic is keeping an eye on job posting trends. And I thought I'd come back to that. We've changed these charts because I thought it'd be better to take a sort of a longer view, as hopefully we're sort of coming to the end of our coronavirus experience, and hopefully we won't have another one. And so what each of these look at is a sort of a two-digit SOC, occupational labour market, to use a technical term, and so they're fairly broad occupational labour markets. And we go through each of the 12 months. So you can see on the x-axis it's 1 to 12 for January to December in the normal way, and then each year is overlapping on it in a different colour. So green is 2019, so before the pandemic. Black is 2020, so the year that the pandemic happened, and the really bad year. And then purple, 2021, when we saw that recovery that we were just talking about. And what you can see here is that in every case, the purple line ends 2021 way above either 2020, which you'd expect because we were recovering, but also 2019 too. And so in every single one of these 25 occupational labour markets, there is more labour market demand, normally by quite some distance, than there was at the same time 2 years ago. So it's not a seasonal effect. It's actually that there is a change. In fact, one thing that is interesting to note, because it's a pattern that's, I think, on every single one of these as well, is that in December, there was quite a marked falling back of labour market demand as measured by job postings data. And so to go back to my comments a moment ago about how sustainable is the level of labour market demand, it feels like there was a real kind of moment of, let's stop trying to recruit quite so much. Still a high level, still way above the level that it was in 2019 in all these cases. But, the sort of the October, November kind of peaks do seem to have come off in most cases. And so I think that's really quite interesting.
And I think we normally do see, in general, a slight drop off in December as not a particularly attractive month to start hiring processes generally. So the question will be, as we come through January, whether that picks back up again or whether we do see continued downshift, and it is maybe some degree of rectification.
Yeah, I mean, normally it's a much slighter change, and these ones, I think you notice it, especially because right up until November, in most of these charts, you can see that the growth was just ploughing on, and it was more and more and more, and then you have this sudden knockback, and it's the sort of the ubiquity of it across the different occupations. So, and some of these occupations have got very different experiences from the others. If you look at caring personal services, say, which is the fourth one down in the middle, you can see, I mean, this is a labour market that, of course, wasn't that badly affected by COVID because we needed care workers in great numbers. And so actually in previous years, even 2020, but 2019 too, demand is fairly stable. And then during 2021, in a labour market that wasn't affected, didn't have to recover in many ways from COVID because it didn't take a dip, and yet it still had this phenomenal growth all the way through the year almost, and then comes back a bit in December. And you compare that to say the leisure and travel, which is right next to it, and you see exactly the same pattern in 2021. Even though that's a labour market that, as you can see, in 2020 took a nosedive, because, of course, that's exactly the kind of industry that suffered worse with the pandemic. And so it's the consistency of the pattern in 2021 across all segments that's really fascinating to me, that it's kind of, yes, there is a recovery, but the recovery seems to have infected even those parts of the labour market that didn't need to recover. And then there's this kind of slight drawing back all at the same time at the end. So there's a real kind of sense of a macro trend underlying it of, it has to be said that we've seen inflation sort of come up a bit from its sort of recent typical levels. And so we're now on about 4 or 5% inflation. And so, you kind of, it does feel like there's a really sort of strong underlying demand sort of pattern underlying this change in labour market demand.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you, Duncan. A good walkthrough of the headlines there, and hopefully useful for folks. So that context is actually very helpful. As Duncan mentioned, in the run up to Christmas, we shared different elements of research. One piece that you may recall was some research called the UK Labour Market Crunch that is available on the Emsi Burning Glass blog, so you can check that out. Looking at really the fact that the labour market heading into Christmas was so tight, and trying to, and thinking about ways in which employers employer behaviour was potentially changing to try and wage the war on for talent, and we had looked at how pay, bonus, the advertising of training benefits, and flexible working were becoming ever more prevalent as employers were having to shout in a very noisy market as they tried to access talent. So all of that kind of falls nicely into what we were just discussing there in terms of those trends. In terms of this session, we want to kind of start to move forward and actually think about what is driving demand more specifically. What is driving this? What is creating the crunch? And is it particular roles and skills that seem to be in demand? Well, what Duncan's just shown us there is clearly it's right across the labour market. And so we then want to look a little bit more about regional variations, because we've really been looking at kind of headline UK trends, and thought it would be helpful to start to dive into regions and localities to understand whether those trends are the same throughout, or whether actually there are different drivers at play in different localities. And then I'll look to conclude by actually pointing you towards some resources that are coming your way very soon that will allow you to dive into even more detail on this topic. So Duncan's going to join me and talk us through some analysis that we've been doing, looking at really what's driving demand currently and how that's changed through last year, as we tour the country. So the new piece of research will be coming away soon, and details following is our UK Regional Labour Market Outlook report, which will be out soon. And we're giving you a sneak peek of some of the outputs and analysis from within there. So let's join me, Duncan, in a quick tour of the UK, and we'll kick off with kind of just a quick few headlines before we dive into looking at some of the regional variations. So I think this is just an evolution of what you were just describing there.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you can sort of see the pattern that we all know and, well, maybe not love, with job postings during 2021 there across the UK, where we had the collapse by about half in terms of new postings, which is the measure that we use here, sort of the actual postings that came through each month. In the aftermath of sort of March, it kind of fell off. And then from that point on, we saw some of a recovery, and it's I think it still remains an interesting thing that the sort of the economic consequences of the first lockdown were never really matched again, because a lot of industries learned how to work with COVID anyway. Construction is one that often is mentioned in this context, where you kind of in the first lockdown, a lot of construction sites were closed and no work was going on. Whereas by the time you come round to the sort of the end of 2020, when we had more COVID problems, building companies had got used to COVID, found ways of working with it. And so you don't see the sort of the labour market demand falling back at the start of 2021, when we had the full lockdown then, to the levels that we had. But then once you get to spring of last year, recovery starts and then sustains, pretty much all the way through. And within that, you see some, quite interesting patterns. Some, what we've done here is just pull out the sort of the fastest growing job titles in the context of that recovery, comparing 2021 to 2020. And you see it's quite a wide mix, a lot of quite mid-skill roles here, especially in the service sectors. The sort of the recovery of hospitality from the lows of 2020, particularly notable, with kitchen porters and chefs and waiting staff. But then admin roles and team members and so on. And then on the skills side, Again, we see the hospitality dimension with restaurant operation in there and food preparation, but we also see sort of the digital dimension. And of course, a lot more people are working from home. There's a lot of growth in web-based services. So you see things like Microsoft Teams, which of course has become a lot more familiar to a lot more people than it used to be. Google Analytics is in there, Power BI and Analytics as well.
Interesting to see sustainability coming out so high. We talked about green jobs a few months back.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's right.
Onboarding of perhaps reflecting the churn that you described of a lot more.
And also, I mean, I think you have to say as well that because of the number of people working from home, and we find this as a business, as you know, is that you have to be a lot more intentional with onboarding staff when you're not in the office together. And so actually these things become quite sort of, significant in their own way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So that's the national picture, just to provide a bit more detail. Fascinating though, when we take that headline of change by region, quite a fascinating story to tell here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the really interesting one here is London, which, because London is so big, it drags down the entire UK average. So every other part of the UK is growing faster than the UK average. And it's because London has actually seen a slight reduction across this 2-year period. And we've touched on this before in these webinars, that London centre has still not returned to normal. The sort of the consumer-facing economy, which of course is very strong in London, with sort of the hospitality economy, with a lot of international tourism, with a large commuter population, all of that has not fully recovered to what it was 2 years ago. Variety of reasons. International travel is obviously greatly impaired by all the COVID restrictions that we see, and by economic circumstances around the world as well, for that matter. Commuting, of course, a large number of those who were commuting into London are professional workers who have been able to switch over to home working. And so all of that combines to mean that the sort of the underlying labour market demand in terms of size in London is really flat. And not going anywhere. So it's the one part of the country that doesn't seem to be seeing this huge recovery in labour market demand. And of course, the areas that are seeing the fastest growth here are some of those that have sometimes struggled in the past participating growth. And so you think about Wales and the North East, which aren't sort of in the economic core of the country. They're further sort of outlying parts of the UK. And yet are absolutely seeing phenomenal growth. I mean, in Wales's case, nearly doubling the volume of job postings coming out at the end of 2021 compared to the start of 2020. And most parts of the UK are actually sort of well into double digits. Even the southeast there, just adjacent to London, is kind of in the 35% sort of range. So so it's quite interesting. And of course, all the talk about levelling up, and on one level, this looks a very promising sign from a sort of labour market demand, that there is kind of such a huge swing in demand in parts of the economy which have often struggled to sort of do well. Northern Ireland's another one up there, which has sort of a range of economic issues sort of at work, but is still seeing a really strong recovery in demand.
Let's also bear in mind the source of this data. So these are online job postings where they state a location of work. And of course, the research, the labour market crunch research that you took us through last time, Duncan, shows significant rise, particularly at the professional end of the labour market, in remote working. And therefore, whereas historically those jobs might have been in London and advertised as such, and London was the great attractor, in effect, to the workforce, it was attractive to be in London, all of a sudden flipped all the way around. And so those might be still the same jobs to some extent. They're just not being promoted as London jobs because they don't have to be London jobs in a remote environment. They could be anywhere, and perhaps mainly targeted at areas that are places where the workforce lives or might aspire to live in the ideal world going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the UK is interesting in this sense because, we only have one sort of, gigantic city in London that is kind of a global economic centre. And our geography outside of London is relatively small. Whereas if you think about the US, we hear a lot of stories about sort of, Silicon Valley workers freed from working at the office in San Francisco and the surrounding area, which is an extremely expensive place to live, and suddenly sort of seeking pastures new for their home life, even while they continue to earn really good money as a Silicon Valley software engineer or whatever it would be. And so you can sort of get the inkling of a similar kind of effect, but without the great population movement, perhaps, that we've seen in the US. Although I believe on house prices there is the sort of the glimmer of a similar kind of thing, because as I understand it, house prices outside of London have, for the first time in sort of recent times, been growing faster outside of London than within it. So yeah, so it's all points in the direction of quite a remarkable change. Of course, earlier today it was announced that the government are going to end its advice to work from home where possible. So whether that will begin to see some degree of reversion in that trend remains to be seen.
Fascinating. So in terms of going forward, we're not going to dig into every one of these regions, but what we are going to do is pick out a few of the outlier examples. You mentioned Wales and the Northeast, and we'll pick up is actually going to be the West Midlands, not the Southeast, and London as we go through. So, and I suppose the fascinating thing is, having looked at the UK position in terms of understanding what's driving demand in those regions. Are we seeing similar trends in each of the regions, or is it actually quite localized? So yeah, let's start our grand tour, and we're going to head to Wales first. So what's driving demand and the growth end of demand? We saw Wales driving significant growth. Where is that growth coming from?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. So because of Wales' industry structure, it didn't get hit that hard compared to other parts of the country by the initial pandemic. So I was talking about London and its kind of centre of hospitality industry and so on. Wales certainly has a hospitality industry, but it also has a lot of production industries that were relatively less affected by the restrictions of the pandemic. A lot of factories were able to keep going. And so its recovery has kind of been built around that in part. And so it partly that it's not just a recovery, it's actually a lot of growth. But what's interesting is that the jobs tend to be quite sort of low to middle skill. So if you look at the titles at the top there, it's HGV drivers, warehouse staff, electricians in there for a middle skill role, production operators is in there. So, quite large volume jobs. And so the actual sheer growth in demand is interesting. But, Wales has a history, not uniquely within the UK, sadly outside of the sort of the greater southeast. A lot of the UK has a sort of a similar side of it, which is that it's sort of its job creation tends to be at the sort of the low to middle skill end rather than at the high skill end. And of course that raises questions about long-term productivity, and the resurgence in the Welsh labour market that is hugely impressive in volume terms seems to be replicating that same kind of pattern, that there's a lot of jobs being created, but they are very much of the jobs that you've come to expect in the past. And so going back to my levelling up comment a little bit before, it's sort of a healthy sign of vigour in the Welsh labour market. But is it really clearing the path to a change in the economy and sort of raising the sort of the underlying prosperity? Well, maybe not. And the skills tell a similar story, that the restaurant skills are there, the supply chain skills are there, but there's not a lot in terms of at the UK level. We saw things like Google Analytics and Power BI. That doesn't come through here.
No, interesting. And as we dig deeper, so we pick out the principal city of Cardiff, we get a different trend again. So, and part of what we're trying to do is highlight the value of diving deep locally, that there is no such thing as single labour market even for Wales. So what are we seeing in Cardiff?
Yeah, I mean, Cardiff helps to, is basically the exception that proves the rule in Wales, and it does so in two ways, really. One is that its overall growth is much less vigorous than the wider Welsh economy. So, whereas, as we saw on the chart early on, overall Welsh job postings are kind of near double the level they were before, growth has been a good, but nothing like that, 38.5%. over the same period of time. And also you can see that Cardiff really was hit quite hard in those early months of the pandemic, in contrast to wider Wales. And so it's sort of quite an interesting contrast, and that's because in part Cardiff has quite a different industry structure to Wales more generally, and has more presence of service sectors that are relatively small in number in much of the rest of Wales. And so you see the sort of the mix is quite different in terms of titles and skills. So you see in amongst the hospitality jobs like chefs and sous chefs and kitchen porters, we've also got marketing executives and data scientists. On the other hand, on the hard skills side, we see some of those skills that are associated with those jobs come through, like stakeholder engagement and software as a service and so on. And so it's kind of quite an interesting pattern where it's not as impressive in quantity terms as a recovery, 39% rather than nearly doubling, but the quality is much more varied in terms of having these higher skilled jobs alongside the low skilled jobs. And I think that that's quite an interesting story that sort of helps you to see that sort of the biggest numbers in terms of recovery are often not necessarily pointing the way to the better sort of economic outcome.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. So we also saw, we picked out the northeast as a strong growth area as well. So anything to take from what's happening under the surface there?
Yeah, I mean, it's similar, although perhaps not as strong in the same way. So the northeast does have a little bit more variation in the kinds of jobs that are coming through at the top end. So we've got sort of alongside the more sort of low middle skill jobs, again, we've also got things like project managers in there as well. And on the skills side, we've got data analysis and finance in there, and forecasting and budgeting and automation as well. So it suggests that actually, although the northeast isn't growing quite as fast as Wales, it is getting a slightly better mix in there.
And interesting to see perhaps in Wales a stronger connection between the job titles and the skills, whereas here some of those skills, thinking about automation, procurement, and other that might be and data analysis, that are emerging skills that might be bleeding right across the economy as opposed to being simply driven by a function of the roles themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not like there's just an obvious kind of correlation between getting lots of restaurant staff and lots of restaurant related skills, say.
Yeah, so interesting, maybe an underlying shift to keep an eye on there. So let's look at the again, digging deeper and picking out the kind of principal urban area for the region. We've got Newcastle.
Yes, exactly. And again, it's quite a similar story to Wales and Cardiff, although again the trend is much less striking. And so the gap between Newcastle and the wider northeast is smaller. And the sort of the difference in variety is much less. So actually, compared to the wider northeast, Newcastle has a similar kind of mix of jobs. A bit more on the sort of the restaurant side, and a bit more on the kind of the sort of the business management side in terms of account managers and HR advisors, and a mix of skills that goes alongside that and has quite a good mix. So it's kind of a similar story, but not quite as strong as you see in Wales.
Yeah, interesting. So moving to the other end of the scale, the West Midlands, not the Southeast, as I had highlighted on my graph, was one that was showing strong growth, but relative to other parts of the country, not quite as exciting. So anything to take from what we're seeing here?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that, of course, we're looking at the top end of change here, and actually it's striking how similar it is to Wales, which, of course, is an adjacent part of the country. And so again, lots of low to middle skill roles generally. Veterinary surgeons is also growing quickly as well. Skills, though, much more mixed and much more interesting in that sense, that whereas Wales's skills were dominated by those lower middle skill roles, so this is much closer to the northeastern skills terms in terms of having that mixture of a variety of skills. So you've got in amongst restaurant operation and food safety and sales booking and things like that, you've also got cybersecurity and information privacy in there. So yeah, there's some kind of positives sort of about the kind of the mix of skills, even if the types of jobs tend to be a little bit more predictable in terms of the sort of the volume end of the scale.
Yeah, absolutely interesting. And then diving into Birmingham.
Yeah, and again, just as we said that the gap between sort of Newcastle and the northeast was smaller than it was between Wales and Cardiff, the gap here is even smaller. So Birmingham, which of course is a big city anyway in the context of the region, it has quite a dominant role. It hasn't grown as quickly as the wider region, but overall, the mix of skills and jobs is not so far away from what we see at the regional level. Still a large number of low-skill jobs, but also some good contributions from some higher skill ones in there, like business analysts, for example, which helps to mix it up. And on the skills side, actually quite a strong role for technology and a sort of professional skills in there.
Yeah, and what strikes me as we look at the region as a whole and then pick out the kind of main urban area, the most populous urban area, is how those urban areas aren't rebounding as quickly as the regional average, which of course by default means the more rural or less urban areas, those smaller towns and hinterlands, therefore must be showing even stronger growth to bring the average up from the major urban areas. So I think it does speak to a trend of advertising and promoting roles outside of major urban centres. You mentioned London in respect to the UK as a whole, but actually as we dig into these regions, seeing the cities not really quite performing at the rate that clearly therefore the rest of the region is to achieve that average.
And again, that's quite interesting in the context of what we were saying about London, that it's that sort of, over the past few decades, we've talked a lot about sort of agglomeration effects and the sort of the importance of cities as drivers of economic change. And actually, maybe the working from home thing is kind of reversing that somewhat. So, yeah, interesting.
And on to our friend London.
Absolutely.
And obviously we've kind of picked London out because it was actually showing a very slight decline on a year before, but that does very much mask still that there is significant growth, but probably more so than any other region is clearly a bigger shift away from some things and towards others. So what are we seeing here?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is the case that there's a big shift, but you do still see a real growth in demand for those hospitality jobs, even though overall the prospects for that industry haven't been as good in London as they have elsewhere. That's probably because it's got a high turnover labour market, especially for those kinds of jobs. And so there's been need to replace people, even if the overall total number of jobs isn't there. And that's something that we've often talked about in the past, that job postings are an indicator of the margin of labour demand rather than the whole of labour demand, and for that we use jobs data. And so actually that's quite an interesting question in itself. But also in here we have a mix of some very obvious kind of business service jobs in there, so sales representatives, HR admins, product designers, customer success managers, account executives as well. And while restaurant operation is in the top 10 skills, we've also got TypeScript and Power BI and content creation and software as a service and systems engineering as well. So on the skills side, very strongly geared towards the sort of the professional and technology skills and away from the more generic ones.
Yeah, so doubling down on what London, the underlying strengths London had.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, there's a question as to whether the job is advertised in London, but do you actually work there anymore in a lot of these kinds of jobs as well?
Yeah, No, absolutely. Well, thanks for taking us on a bit of a tour there. We wanted to just highlight a few examples and some interesting talking points that we had certainly, as we saw the research, had taken from it, and hopefully it's been valuable to share that with you. But the good news is we do have a report coming very soon, and soon is a technical definition of time span, I believe, but very soon on the Emsi Burning Glass website. It'll be advertised via our blog, but also as registrants for this webinar, you should receive a link as soon as it is available that actually walks through a lot of these trends, goes into each of the regions. We've only picked out a few, and the principal cities for those regions. And what's more, we're also setting up such that you can request a supplementary report for each specific local area of your choosing, ranging from each of the LEPs in England to the local authority geography across the whole of the UK. So keep an eye out for that. So if you want to know what's going on, not just nationally, you can, if you want to look at the kind of national and big picture trends that we've been working through, regional trends, then the report will give you some good insights there, but you will be able to then dive down into very specific localities of your choosing in due course. So hopefully we've whetted your appetite for that, and please do keep an eye out for that. And as we make that available, you should be able to download that. Just a quick update as well. So you'll know that as an organisation, or as organisations, Emsi and Burning Glass merged last year. We're bringing together our complementary skills and expertise and data around labour market information. And we're now starting to make some fantastic progress globally as a business on bringing together the best of those worlds into more integrated services. So Duncan, you're able actually to give us a very quick update on one of the kind of major milestones that we've been working towards from a UK data perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we merged, we were two companies before that both had job postings data, and we've been doing a lot of work over the past 6 months to work out how to get the best of both of those types of job postings data, and so work out how to get the best quality, the best enrichments, and all of that from it. We are looking at sometime around the middle of February, making a change to the new integrated job posting source. This will feed analysts, so analyst users will see the difference. It won't feed Labour Insight, but for reasons I'll go on to in a moment, that won't be as important, but also it opens a path to Labour Insight users to start considering analysts as their tool for the future as well. The reason why we're not sort of moving it into Labour Insight is that what we, at the heart of the new data, will be the posting source that Labour Insight users are used to with Burning Glass. Burning Glass, as one of our predecessor companies, really specialised in questions of sourcing and quality control, and that means that for analyst users, they'll see a huge improvement in the sort of quality of data that we've got, not just now, but into the future. We've seen quite a change in how job boards aggregate postings over the past few years, and we've been trying to make sure that we kind of stay on top of that. It generates a lot of noise, basically. You'll also see substantial improvements in location accuracy, which will be really powerful for a lot of local users, and the ability to export up to 500 example job postings from your query, including the body text as well. And the really exciting thing is it opens the path up to further improvement in the future as we bring across sort of new technologies in terms of improving our company naming, improving our grouping of different types of jobs using different methods and so on. So yeah, lots of exciting stuff. We'll be communicating more formally over the next few weeks to prepare people for the changes that they'll see and on what benefits it will bring. And so keep an eye out if you're an analyst user, and we'll keep Labour Insight users in the loop because they'll have the opportunity to participate as well.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so as mentioned, this work is underway, and our intention is that we'll be able to help help customers take advantage of that within the next month or so. But keep an eye out for emails and notes within the products where we can keep you updated on the more specific elements and the timescales of that. And just to summarize, this is about enhancing the quality of data for job postings data for analyst users, but labor insight users. It is that data to some extent, so no immediate change there for you to worry about. So yeah, good news, and one of the key milestones as a business, we're looking to bring the best of both worlds together into the new environment. And if anyone watching here is also a user of US data, that's actually recently just been changed over into that single central source as well. So lots of work going on all around the world. So we'll keep you posted. Thank you, Duncan. So coming towards the end of today's session, I'm going to put Debbie on notice in case there's any questions she wants to throw to Duncan and I on your behalf. But just pointing you towards another webinar coming up from our fantastic colleague, Carla. So later this month on the 25th, she will be talking about the Skills for Jobs white paper and how that's really influencing a lot of activity in the further education and skills sector. And so Carla will be talking through how data like ours, labour market insight, is proving ever more critical to the demands on the sector going forward. And so she'll be sharing some great examples and discussion around that topic. In due course, head to the webinars page to sign up for that if you are interested. So yes, Debbie, do we have any questions at all?
Well, actually, we're quite sparse on questions today, but just one which is would be interesting for a few people is one of our delegates wants to know if they can drill down at the industry and sector level rather than a regional level. And obviously we do in our tool, but I thought you might like to just answer that quickly.
Yeah, so that's a good question. At the moment in Emsi analyst, you can't sort job postings by industry sector. When we make the initial switch, you still won't be able to, but it will be not too long in the future. That's one of the enhancements that this change will pave a way to. So basically, sort of within the next few months, we anticipate that you'll be able to do that.
But the critical thing in terms of this research is really very much focused on the regional dimension. This is just all of the analysis that we show here is being pulled from our data. So if you have very specific requests and you're not an Emsi Burning Glass customer, then I would thoroughly encourage you to reach out and find out how you might be able to get access to this information, so you can do your own drill downs within the tools and services that we've got that leverage the same data. So hopefully a good showcase for you. But if you need more, that's where our commercial services definitely come in handy for you.
That's great. Thanks, Andy. No more questions.
No more. No more questions, Your Honour. Marvellous. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. We're planning our next Emsi Burning Glass corporate webinar, but we haven't yet firmed up a date with various half-term holidays and breaks in February. We're just trying to find a sensible spot for you, so keep an eye out for that. But certainly from me, thank you very much for joining us today. Hope you find that information interesting, and keep an eye out for the link which will be coming your way in due course with access to that free report and your local reports. We'd love to hear your feedback and find out if it's helpful or useful to you, as that helps to shape our other work going forward in our research program, which we obviously plan to illuminate on our monthly webinars. So thanks for me. Thank you, Duncan, for joining me and taking us through the latest statistics and some of the key trends that you're taking from that research. And thank you, Debbie, for hosting us so ably once again today.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for attending. Bye-bye.